B'siyata d'shmai, we're going to learn sukkah Daf. Hey, we're going to start 6 lines from the bottom of Daf Daled Amud base. Says the Gemara, V'she'eino gavoya asara tvachim. This takes us back to the Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, that one of the halachas of sukkah is that if the airspace between the schach and the floor is not 10 tvachim high, the sukkah is possible. Asks the Gemara, Minolon, what would be the source for such a halacha? Where do we know that a covering, a schach, which is not a covering over 10 tfachim, is not considered schach? Itmar, we learned, Rav, V'Rabbi Chanina, V'Rabbi Yochanan, V'Rav Chaviva, a group of 4 chachomim, Masnu, they learned as follows, they taught as follows. And by the way, the Gemara mentions that Bekula Seder Moed, in the whole of Seder Moed, Kol Ki Hai Zuga, whenever you have this group of 4 chachomim, Chilufei Rabbi Yochanan, Umayil Rabbi Yonason. Then there are those who remove, they say that it's not Rabbi Yochanan in the group, it's Rabbi Yonason. But what do these 4 chachomim say? Where do they learn that the concept of schach only applies when it's hovering over an airspace of 10 tfachim? They learn it out from the Shechina. We know that the Shechina used to come down on top of the Orin and speak to Moshe Rabbeinu and Klal Yisrael from on top of the Kapores, on top of the covering, on top of the Orin. We know that there was the Orin, which was 1.5 amas high. On top of that, there was a covering, which is the Kapores, and from on top of that, the Shechina would speak. Orin Tisha, we know that the Orin was 9 tfachim high, it was 1.5 amas high, every amma is 6 tfachim, 9 tfachim high. The Kapores, the covering itself, Tefach was a Tefach, Harikan Hasara. So we know that the Orin with the covering was 10 tfachim. Uchsiv, and it says in another pasuk, v'noyadati lecha Hashem v'dibarti itcha me'al hakaperes mibein shnei akruvim asher al Orin oidos eis kol asher atzave oischa el bnei Yisrael. The Shechina says, I will come down until the top of the cover of the Orin. From there I will speak to you. V'tanya, we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Yossi Omer, me'olam lo yordo Shechina lemata. The Shechina insisted on not coming down. Any area that's considered mata, low down, the Shechina wouldn't go there. And similarly, Moshe ve'Eliyahu, even though Moshe Rabbeinu and Eliyahu Hanavi did go up towards the heavens, they didn't go lamorim to the heavens, they didn't reach the heavens. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk in Tehillim, Hashamayim shamayim lashem. The heavens are exclusively for Hashem, so to speak. V'ha'oretz, and land, nosan livnei Adam, is, so to speak, exclusively for man. Which means that the heavens, and we're soon going to learn the 10 tfachim, just below the heavens, those are exclusively for the Shechina. The earth and 10 tfachim above the earth are exclusively for man. The area in between is shared by both. So what do we see from here? We see that the Shechina would come down until on top of the Kapores, and it would not come down below that. And we learnt that the Pasuk says, Hashemayim shamayim lashem v'oretz nosan livnei Adam, but we don't know how far, what's called Oretz, how much off the land is an area given to man, not, and the Shechina does not go there. So from the very fact that the Shechina came down and the Shechina told Moshe Rabbeinu, I am going until the top of the Kapores and not lower, so we obviously see from there that from the top of the Kapores and lower is an entity of its own, a Rishus on its own, which the Shechina will not enter. So you see that 10 tfachim is considered an entity. Since it's considered an entity, when you have schach covering over that area, it's considered a schach which is covering a whole entity, a whole Rishus, and that's the source that schach has to cover an airspace of 10 tfachim. Asks the Gemara, V'lo yordo Shechina lemata, and the Shechina never came in the 10 tfachim down adjacent to the land, to the earth. V'oksiv, does it not say in the pasuk, Vayered Hashem al har Sinai, al rosh hahar, vayikra Hashem leMoshe al rosh hahar vayal Moshe? Does it not say that Hashem came down onto Mount Sinai, which was the 10 tfachim close to the ground? Answers the Gemara, L'maylo me'asara tfachim, that the Shechina came down on top of the mountain, but it didn't reach the mountain, it stayed 10 tfachim above the mountain. Asks the Gemara, V'aksiv, does it not say in the Pasuk, V'omdu raglov bayomahu al harazeisim ashal pnei Yerushalayim mikedem, etc., that the Shechina is going to come and, so to speak, rest its legs on harazeisim. So you see the Shechina does come down. Answers the Gemara, L'mayla me'asara tfachim. Again, the Shechina will stay above 10 tfachim. And you mentioned before that Moshe Rabbeinu and Eliyahu Hanavi, even though they went up, they ascended to the heights of the heavens, they didn't go to the heavens. V'aksiv, does it not say in the Pasuk, Moshe Ola Elo Elukim Vayikra Elov Hashem Nahar Lemer Koisim Aleves Yaakov V'Sagid Levnei Yisrael? Does it not say that Moshe went up to the Shechina? So you see that he went up to the Shamayim. Answers the Gemara, Lemato me'asara, there were 10 tfachim beyond the Shamayim, and Moshe did not enter that space. Asks the Gemara, V'aksiv, regarding Eliyahu Hanavi, does it not say, Vayihi heima holchim holich v'daber, v'hinei rechev eish, v'susei eish, v'yafridu bein shneim, v'ya'al Eliyahu basa'oro hashamayim, that Eliyahu Hanavi went up in a whirlwind up to the heavens. So you see that Eliyahu Hanavi did go up. Again, the Gemara answers, Lemata me'asara, he went up, but he did not enter the 10 tfachim closest to the Shamayim. Asks the Gemara, V'aksiv, does it not say in another pasuk, Ma'achiz pnei kisei, that Hashem allowed Moshe to grasp the face of the throne, Parshes olov anonoi, and Hashem spread over Moshe Rabbeinu his cloud. So if the cloud of Hashem, the Shechina, was spread over Moshe Rabbeinu, it would seem that Moshe Rabbeinu did go up to the heavens. Va'omer of Tanchim Melamed, we see from there that from the word Parshes actually spells out the words Shapires Shakai Miziv Shchinosoi, that Hashem spread from his radiance onto Va'anonoi and his cloud Olav onto Moshe Rabbeinu. So you see that Moshe Rabbeinu went up to the Shamayim, and the Mefarshim discuss why we need Rav Tanchim over here. It seems to be that that's what the Pasuk itself is saying, but the Gemara answers, Lemato me'asara, that the Shechina came down and covered Moshe Rabbeinu, but Moshe Rabbeinu himself did not enter those 10 tfachim which were Shamayim. Asks the Gemara, Mikol Mokim, does it not say, at the end of the day, if you look in the Pasuk, it says, Ma'achiz pnei kiseiksiv. It says that Moshe Rabbeinu could hold the throne, and the throne would seem to be a concept which is in Shamayim. Answers the Gemara, Ishtarvu ve'ishtarvu le'kisei. The throne actually came down towards Moshe Rabbeinu, ad asara, to the area of 10 tfachim below the Shamayim, v'nokat be, and then Moshe Rabbeinu could hold it from there. Says the Gemara, Bishlei ma'orin tisha. So we've learned from all this that the orin was 9, the cover was 1, the Shechina came down till the top of the cover of the orin, it's 10 tfachim, and the Shechina refused to come down below that. It must be the area below that is the definition of an entity of its own. That's why it's called a schach. The Gemara is now saying, I understand that you know that the orin itself is 9 tfachim. Orin tisha, Tichsiv, it says in the Pasuk, V'osu aroin atzei shitim, the orin was made of cedar wood, amosayim v'chetzi orkoi, v'ama v'chetzi rochboi, v'ama v'chetzi koimosoi. These are dimensions of the orin. They were 2.5 amos by 1.5 amos by 1.5 amos high. 1.5 amos high is 1.5 times 6 tfachim is 9 tfachim. Elo kapiras tefach minolon. How do you know that the covering on top of the orin was a tefach high? Was a tefach thick? The Tony Reb Chanina, Kol akelim she'osa Moshe, nitno bem Torah midas orkon, umidas rachbon, umidas kimoson. All the utensils that Moshe was told to make, or was instructed to make sure that they got made, the measure, the height, the width, and the length of it was told exactly what they should be. Kapiras, however, this cover on top of the orin, midas orko, midas rochbo nitno. The length and the width, it was given, it was covering the orin, it was 2.5 by 1.5. But midas kemoso, but the height of it, the thickness of it, lo nitno, was not given. So how do you know that the kapiras was a tefach? That's the question of the Gemara. Answers the Gemara, Let's assume it was the same thickness as the smallest of any of the utensils in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Mishkan. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, you should make for it mizgeres. They're talking about the table, the shulchan. It had a border going round it, toifach soviv. It was going round. It was 1 tefach high. This border going around the table. And there would be a little crown on top of the shulchan as well. But what do we see from here? That this border was a tefach, and that's the smallest measure mentioned in the Chumash regarding the utensils of the Mishkan. So let's assume ma lehalon tefach, in the same way as this mizgeres, this border going between the feet or around the table, is a tefach. So to the kaperes, the covering of the orin, will be afkan tefach. Ask the Gemara. If you don't know where to learn it from, why would you learn it from the border going around the shulchan? V'neilef mikelim gufei. Learn it out from the actual dimensions of the entire kelim, which was much more than a tefach. Answers the Gemara. Tofasta meruba loy tofasta. Tofasta muad. Tofasta, and Rashi says this is a moshel. That if somebody's told to grab, to seize something, then if he seizes the smallest measure, that will definitely stay in his hands. If he was supposed to seize more, he'll be given more. But if he was supposed to seize a little bit, and he takes a lot, then it will be taken away from him. Who told you to take so much? Maybe you were only supposed to take less. And what he's holding, he's going to lose. Or part of it he will lose. And that's a mashal to here, which we say that if you can choose from either a very large or a larger measure and a smaller measure, assume that it's the smaller measure is the safest one to rely on. Asks the Gemara, okay, so you're going for the smallest measure of the kelim, v'neilef mitzitz. We know there was the golden plate on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol, called the tzitz. The Tanya we learned in the Breitzer. Tzitz, this tzitz was doime kamin tas shel zov. It was made with a thin plate of gold. V'rochav beis etzbois. It was only 2 fingers breadth wide. Umukaf me'oizen le'oizen. It would surround him from one ear to the next. V'kosav olav, and on it was written beis shit in 2 lines. Yud Kei, Hashem's name, milamayla on the top line. V'kodesh lamed milamata, that it should be kodesh, sanctified, holy to Hashem. So Hashem's name is on the first line, and the kodesh la in the second line. V'omer Rabbi Eliezer bar Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Eliezer bar Rabbi Yosi says, Anira isiv baroimi. When I went into the Vatican and I saw in Rome this tzitz, v'kosav olav kodesh l'Hashem b'shita achas. Kodesh l'Hashem was written on 1 line, and not like we saw in the Brisa, written on those 2 lines. But either way, the height of the tzitz was only 2 fingers breadth. So why do you say that the kaperes, the cover of the orin, was a whole tefach? Because you learn out from the mizgeres, the border around the shulchan. Why don't you say it was only 2 fingers width, and you learn it from the tzitz? Answers the Gemara, Donin kli mikli. We learn out a halacha of a vessel, the kaperes, the cover of the orin, mikli, from a vessel, from a part of the shulchan, which was a vessel, and we're talking about the tefach going around it. Ve'ein donin kli mitachshit. But we wouldn't learn the halacha, the height of the cover of the orin, from the tzitz, where the tzitz itself is just an ornament, something which is worn. It's not a utensil. Asks the Gemara, okay, but there's something within the utensils that's even less than a tefach. V'neilef mizeir. The zeir, the crown that was surrounding 3 of the kelim, there was on the orin, on the mizbeach, and on the shulchan, there was a little crown. The Omar Mar, zeir mashahu, the height of that crown was just a mashu, just a little bit, the smallest amount. There wasn't even a minimum measure. So maybe we should learn from the zeir that the thickness of the orin, the cover of the orin, was also just the tiniest amount. Answers the Gemara, Donin kli mikli, ve'ein donin kli mehechshor kli. We'd rather learn the dimensions, the height of the cover of the orin, from the mizgeret, the border around the table, which is a vessel, from a vessel, rather than learning out the vessel, which is the cover of the orin, from a hechshor kli, from something which is not more than a decoration, an ornament. The zeir is just an ornament. If so, asks the Gemara, Ihachi, Mizgeres Nami, this border around the Shulchan, Nami, Hechsher Klihu, it was also just a decoration. It was on top of it was a decorative border around the table. So why is that better than the Zeir? And if you learn out from a decoration, learn it from a Zeir, not from this Mizgeres, and then the cover of the Oren would only have been a Mashu. Answers the Gemara, Mizgartei lematohisa. Because there's a machlokes, we'll soon see where this border was. Was it on top of the tabletop, in which case indeed it was an ornament, it was just a decoration, or was it under the tabletop, in which case it was not a decoration, it was actually there to hold the feet together, to support the tabletop. It was not considered a hechsher, and is not considered just a mere ornament and decoration. Says the Gemara, according to the opinion that indeed this border was under the tabletop, then I can understand that it's not called a kishut, it's not called an ornament, and therefore you would learn from the mizgeres to the cover of the orin. According to the opinion who says that this border was on top of the tabletop, and it was just a decorative type of ornament, if so, if you're already learning from a kishut, from an ornament, learn it from a zeir. What you're going to say, Hi hechsher kli. This is also just a hechsher kli. It's just an ornament, a decoration. Elo, says the Gemara, Donin dovo shenitna by Torah mida, midovo shenitna by Torah mida. This mizgeres, the Torah itself gave it a measure, a tefach. It's a minimum measure which the Torah gave. Osisalei mizgeres, toifach soviv. However, the tzitz, you're right, it was 2 fingers breadth, but that's not something explicit in the Chumash. The zeir was a mashahu, that's not explicit in the Chumash. The Torah did not write the measure. Says the Gemara, Rav Huna Omar Mehocha. Rav Huna says no. Rav Huna says, I'll tell you where we learn from that the cover of the Orin is a tefach. He says Mehocha. Al pnei hakapeires keidma. When it's talking about this kapeires, this cover, when it talks about the ponim, which is the face of this cover, keidma is the east. That's to do with what the pasuk is talking about there in the parasha of the Yom Kippur Avodah. We don't need to go into that now. But this kapeires has a ponim, has a face. Ve'ein ponim pochis mitefach. A face, it's true that it's the face of the cover is just the outer edge, one of the edges of this kapeires, but the term used is a face, and a human face, the minimum size of a human face is a tefach. And since the kapeires had a face, so to speak, had a pnei kapeires, we know it was a tefach. Asks the Gemara, well, all you know from the pasuk is that pnei kapeires, that the kapeires had a face. Who told you that the kapeires was the face, the minimum size of a human face? Maybe it's ka'ape, like the face of a debar yuchni, which was a very big bird. And in the Gemara in Bechira says it was such a big bird that one of its eggs once cracked, and the liquids from the egg managed to drown 60 cities, etc. So if he's talking about a face, maybe the face of the kapeires, the width of the kapeires, was that like the face of this big bird, this bar yuchni. Answers the Gemara like we saw before, tafasta meruba loy tafasta, tafasta mu'at tafasta. If you've got 2 faces to choose from, a very big one and a smaller one, you're safer choosing the smaller one. It's more probable that it's the smaller one. Asks the Gemara, maybe it's the face of a very small bird, which is much smaller than a tefach. Answers the Gemara, Omer Vacha Bayakiv, Rav Huna, that this Rav Huna that says that you learn from pnei kapeires that ein ponim pochis mitefach, he's learning it from a gzeira shava, that it says over there pnei kapeires. Uchsiv Hosam, and elsewhere it says in the pasuk me'es pnei Yitzchok Oviv, it refers to Yitzchok as having a face. So you see that we're talking about a human face, and the smaller size of a human face is a tefach. And regarding that small bird, it doesn't say in that context in the pasuk the word pnei, face, so therefore we don't learn from there. Asks the Gemara, V'neilev, why don't you learn Gzeira Shava from a different place in the Torah where it speaks about ponim? It's the ponim shel maila. It's the face, so to speak, of malachim, of some esoteric beings. Dichsiv, it says in the Pasuk, Vayomer Yaakov, Alno, imno motzosi chen beinecho velokachto minchosi miyodi, ki al kein ro'isi ponecho ki ro'is pnei Elokim vatirtzeini. That it's talking there about that Yaakov Avinu saw the face of some angels, vatirtzeini, and you were appeased by me. So you see there that pnei, the word face, could be a very big face, the face of an angel. Says the Gemara again, Tofasta meruba loy tofasta, tofasta mu'at tofasta. Asks the Gemara, V'neiluf mikruv. Why don't you learn it out from one of the kruvim? We know that on top of the Orin, there were two kruvim that were made of gold, which were two forms. They had wings, their faces we'll soon see what the faces were made like, but they were called kruvim, and these kruvim had a face. So why don't you learn from the kruv? It says in the pasuk, "V'hoyu kruvim poirusei knofayim." These kruvim, their wings were spread out, lemailo, above, seichachin bekanfem. It was actually above their heads. We're going to see that soon, and it was covering over with their wings ala kaperes, over this kaperes. Upneim ish elochiv. The face of the two kruvim were facing each other. Ela kaperes iu pnei hakruvim. So you see there's a concept called pnei hakruvim. And the pnei hakruvim, at this point we assume, is even less than a tefach. So why are you saying pnei, the smaller size of a human face, was a tefach? Maybe it was even less. Learn pnei from the pnei hakruvim. Answers the Gemara, Omer Vacha Bayakiv, Gemiri, we have a tradition, ein pnei kruvim pchusen mitefach. That those faces of the kruvim that were on top of the Orin, they were also no less than a tefach. Rav Huna nami mehocha gomir. Rav Huna himself, who learns pnei, doesn't learn it from pnei Yitzchok. He learns it from the ponim of the kruvim. And indeed, we have a tradition, the ponim of the kruvim were no less than a tefach. Says the Gemara, and this seems to be just not to do with the sugya we just learned directly, it seems to be something else. Now that we've mentioned the kruvim, asks the Gemara, Umay kruv, what was the shape of this kruv? Said Omer Bavo, Kravya. It was like the form of a little child. Shakein bebovel koirin liyanuka ravya. A little child, a yanuka, is called ravya, and that's what kruvim. Kruvim is similar to the words ravya, and ravya is a child. Omele Abaya says, if so, I've got a question. Elomeato dichsiv, it says in the pasuk in Yecheskel, it says that va'arbo ponim le'echod, pnei ha'echod pnei ha'kruv, u'pnei ha'sheni pnei odom, etc. So you see there's a concept called pnei ha'kruv, and there's a concept called pnei ha'odom. And now you're telling me that the form of the kruvim were the form of a child, of a person, so pnei odom and pnei kruv is the same. Hainu kruv, hainu odom, because you just said now that a kruv is the shape of a child. Answers the Gemara, exactly. The difference is that odom, aparavrava, and the pnei odom is a large face, and the kruvim is apazutra, which is the form of a child. That very small shiur, the smallest face, the face of a child, was no less than a tefach. So we learn from the kruvim that the ponim was a tefach, so too the pnei kaperes was a tefach. Continues the Gemara. Umimai dechalolo asoro bar mischocha ema behadeschocha. We are taking it for granted that the minimum size sukkah is referring to the airspace. The airspace underneath the schach has to be 10 tefachim. Where do we learn 10 tefachim from? We just said we learn it from the orin v'kaperes. The orin v'kaperes was 10 tefachim, but the orin v'kaperes, the cover of the orin, was included in the 10 tefachim. So maybe by sukkah the schach is included in the 10 tefachim, and as long as you have 10 tefachim from the top of the schach till the floor, it's kosher, even if you don't have airspace of 10 tefachim. Says the Gemara, Elo mi beis oilomim gomar, and this is a whole new part of the sugya. The very first question we asked, that at the bottom of Daf Daled Amud Beis, the Gemara answered in the name of Fuch Achomim. We learn it from Orin Tisha v'Kaperes Tefach, and then we had a whole Gemara. Now the Gemara says no. How do you know that schach, the minimum schach has to be, that means the minimum sukkah has to be an airspace of 10 tfachim, is not necessarily learnt out from the height of the orin, rather it's learnt out from the area, the airspace underneath the wings of the kruvim, between the wings of the kruvim, between the lowest part of the wings of the kruvim, between the underneath of the wings of the kruvim and the top of the cover of the orin, which is on which the kruvim were standing, then that is the distance. That means the wings are considered as schach. They are seichach, they are covering over the area underneath it. And we'll soon see the area underneath the kruvim were exactly 10 tfachim. So you see that schach means covering an airspace of 10 tfachim. Where would we know that from? Mi beis ilomim gomar. And it's very interesting. In the Mishkan, the orin and the kruvim were made by Moshe Rabbeinu. And those kruvim were actually standing on top of the kapiris, on top of the cover of the orin. However, the kruvim that Shlomo HaMelech made, they were actually standing on the ground on their feet next to the orin. So let's see. Mi beis ilomim gomar, we're going to learn it from the Beis HaMikdash. It says by the Beis HaMikdash, a pasuk in Melachim, v'habayis asher bono HaMelech Shlomo l'Hashem, this home, the Beis HaMikdash that Shlomo HaMelech built for Hashem, shishim amo orkoi, or 60 amos long, v'esrim rochboi, and 20 wide, u'shloishim amo koimosoi. It was 30 amos high. Uchsiv. So we know that the Beis HaMikdash, the Kodesh Kadoshim, for all intents and purposes, what we're speaking about now, is 30 amos high. What else does it say in Melachim? Uchsiv, Koimas hakruv ho'echod. This is Shlomo HaMelech's kruvim. They were standing on the ground. How high was the kruv? Eser ba'amo, 10 amos. V'chein hakruv hasheni. So you see that each kruv was 10 amos high. How high was the whole Kodesh Kadoshim? It was 30. So you see, V'tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Memotzinu, B'beis ilomim, kruvim b'shlish habayis heim oimdim, in the same way as by the Beis HaMikdash, where it's explicit. The Kodesh HaKadoshim was 30 amos high. The kruvim were 10 amos high, which means that the kruvim themselves, not their wings were even higher, but the heads, the top of the heads of the kruvim was a third of the height of the bayis. Mishkan Nami, so also by the Mishkan, where the kruvim were standing on top of the orin, nonetheless, the top of the heads of the kruvim were a third of the height of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. B'shlish habayis imimdim, they were standing a third height of the bayis. Mishkan kam mehava. How tall was the Mishkan? Eser amos. It was 10 amos. It says in the pasuk, Eser amos oirech hakeresh. The planks of wood that was made up the Mishkan were 10 amos long. That was the height. Kama havalu. 10 amos is how many tfachim? Shitin pushchi is 60 tfachim. Tulose kamahava, how much is a third of the height? Esrim pushchi, 20 tfachim. Now we know, how tall is the orin and the kapiris? 10 tfachim. Dal asara, the orin v'kapiris, poshuluhu, what's left? Asara. So you know that between the top of the kapiris and the top of the heads of the kruvim was 10 tfachim, because that way we know it was a third of the height of the bayis. Uchsiv, and it says, V'hoyu akruvim poirosei knofayim. These kruvim, they had wings spread out, lemaila, on top of the heads of the kruvim. Soichachin bekanfem. You hear the word schach. It was covering over with their wings ala kapiris, over the kapiris. So kari rachmanas chacha. These wings are considered a schach. The Torah calls them a schach in the pasuk here, and it's l'maylo me'asara, and it was above a 10 tfachim airspace. So you see that schach is considered an area which is covering an airspace of 10 tfachim. Asks the Gemara, Mimayde got finu ilavei reishehu kaimi. All this is good if you assume that the wings are just above the heads of the kruvim. The heads of the kruvim were up to 10 tfachim off the orin. Total 20 tfachim off the ground, a third of the height of the bayis. And immediately above that was the wings. So you see that schach is covering an airspace of 10 tfachim. Dilma lahadi reishayu kaima. Maybe the wings were not above the heads. Maybe the wings were flush with the heads. And therefore the airspace, or more accurately, the wings were included in the 10 tfachim. And again, you don't have proof that you need an airspace of 10 tefachim. Omer v'achabayakir, no, that can't be. L'maylo ksiv, it says explicitly, the wings were on top. They were covering above the heads of the kruvim. Says the Gemara, v'eimer de midli tuva, who says that it was just above the heads? Maybe it was much higher above the heads, in which case schach might need much more than 10 tefachim. All you know is that the top of the heads of the kruvim was 10 tefachim above the cover of the orin. So if the wings were just there, you have an airspace of 10 tefachim, but maybe the wings were much higher. Says the Gemara, miksiv l'maylo. Does the pasuk say that the wings were l'maylo high above? No, it says l'maylo, just above the heads. So this is the source that the schach has to cover 10 tefachim of airspace. Says the Gemara, honich, all this is good l'Reb Meir. According to Reb Meir, and in both explanations, that were both based on the fact that the orin was 9 tefachim high. According to Reb Meir, all the amos regarding these kelim were average amos. They were not the small amos of 5 tefachim each, and not the big ones that were 6 tefachim plus. Rather, they were the average ones, which were 6 tefachim, and 6 tefachim per amma. 1.5 ammas is 9 tefachim. That's fine. Elo Rabbi Yehuda de amma amo bas b'shel binyan, 6 tefachim v'ammo v'shel kelim. Chamisha, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the amma, in context of the kelim, the utensils, it was just 5 tefachim, so an amma and a half is only 7.5 tefachim, plus the cover another tefach, 8.5 tefachim. Michael Mema, what are you going to say? Orin v'kaperes kama havaluhu. How high was the orin in the kaperes? To manyo palga, only 8.5 tefachim. And we said that the top of the heads of the kruvim must be 20 tefachim, which is a third of the bias. So how much airspace have you got from the top of the cover until the wings? Pashtaluhu chatzri palga. So you have 11.5 tefachim of airspace. So maybe according to Rabbi Yehuda, the minimum airspace in a sukkah has to be 11.5 tefachim. Elo, says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who cannot learn 10 tefachim from the way we've learned it till now, he must learn, where do we know 10 tefachim from? Hilchasa Gemirila. He learns Aloch Moshe Sinai, the Omer Abchia Bar Ashi, Omar Rav, Shiurin, measurements, Chatzitzin, the concept of Chatzitza, when there's a separation between the water and something that needs to be toveled in the water, and Mechitzin and walls, separations, Mechitzos, Halacha Moshe Sinai. And Halacha Moshe Sinai, we learn that the minimum size of a mechitza is 10 tefachim. So a sukkah needs a mechitza, it needs walls. The minimum size of walls that are considered walls is 10 tefachim. So it must be that the schach is on top of that, is covering an area that's walled in. 10 tefachim of airspace is walled in. On top of that, you've got the schach. That's the minimum size sukkah. And in the next shiurim, Yetz Hashem, we're going to go into details more about the shiurin, chatzitzin, and mechitzin.